This is the Open University. We continue with a program for students of the Social Sciences course, Patterns of Inequality. It's called Eastern Europe, Access to Education, and looks at education as an agency for social change. The program is introduced by Andrew Blowers of the Open University.
All industrial societies lay great emphasis on education. In part, this results from the need to develop skills in order to create complex industrial societies. In the case of Britain, as we saw in TV Programme 7 and in Unit 12, there have been considerable changes in educational policy since the war. For example, the abolition of selection at 11, the introduction of comprehensive schools, and efforts at positive discrimination. And all of these, we could say, stem partly from an egalitarian impulse. Now, in Eastern Europe, the emphasis has been perhaps even stronger, an attempt to dispossess those who had previously had privileges, and conversely, a vigorous policy of positive discrimination, an attempt to give access to education to the most disadvantaged groups, the peasants and the workers especially. This was to some extent part of the egalitarian philosophy, but also an attempt to replace the existing intelligentsia and to create a workers' intelligentsia, part of the ideological impulse of Marxist philosophy. So in Eastern Europe, we might say that education is in the forefront of the attempt to create a socialist society. Well, how has it worked out in practice? Has a new social transformation been achieved in educational policy in these countries? What kind of inequalities still persist? I have again with me in the studio George Kalankiewicz of the University of Essex, who's going to comment on various observations made by those people living in Hungary and Poland. So let's begin with one of these observations made by Dr. Bakshi of the Hungarian National Bank.
Now the question is whether there was a fundamental change in Hungarian society in the past 30 years, or wasn't there such a change? I would say there was a very great re-stratification and a very high vertical mobility in the Hungarian society up to the end of the 50s, when there was a lot of promotion of workers who were active in the trade union movement or in the party or Communist Party, or before that in the Social Democratic Party. And those workers who were more active and better informed on world affairs, and usually were very good in their own job, were promoted to directors, managers, and so on. And at the same time, there was quite a considerable training, special academy, so-called Red Academy, that was the nickname of it. It was called an economic and technological academy. 3 years training was set up to train those guys. And at the same time, university graduates from worker and peasant stock had a very fast promotion because there was a very big thirst for such graduates. And through that, there was a very great re-stratification in the Hungarian society. In the 60s and early 70s, that process, by the nature of that process, slowed down, because if you have a consolidated social system, if you have passed that period and you have set up training institutions, then you naturally expect your high-level manpower to come from those schools, institutes, and universities.
Well, Dr. Bakshi seems to be suggesting that there was a fairly fundamental change, at least in the early phase, in Hungarian society through education, Do you think it's as significant as he suggests? Were in fact the intelligentsia that previously existed displaced?
Yes, I would agree across the board for most of the East European societies that several processes occurred. Firstly, for reasons of political reliability, you did have the promotion of workers to managers, directors, these so-called worker directors, who, although they may have been good at their own jobs, doesn't necessarily mean that they were good directors and managers. Now, obviously, it wasn't so negative because you had this particular economic system that emerged during the early periods of industrialization, socialist reconstruction, was a fairly directed economy, so really these directors simply had to take orders. So really it didn't matter too much whether they were good managers in the traditional sense of that word. The intelligentsia were displaced, what remained of the intelligentsia, because you must remember that they were a considerably smaller social group, those that survived the Second World War. They were displaced, and one of the major consequences, you could argue, was the alienation of large sections of the pre-war intelligentsia from participation and a responsibility for the development of Poland up until 1956. On the other hand, these crash courses of education for workers and peasants meant that you had qualifications which were frequently of dubious value. I mean, many of the crash courses for 2 or 3 years were actually simply just as it were, a bestowing of a qualification, of a diploma upon these workers to, as it were, at least superficially make them adequate for the posts of managers. And there was a considerable amount of conflict in educational institutions between the traditional professors and others and these new workers who were imposed upon, these new workers and peasants who were imposed upon them, as well as between students of intelligentsia background and those of peasant and worker backgrounds. And this, I think, is something which has been recorded quite adequately. The extent of the change is something that was judged in the post-war period when we can see a reversal back to a situation where you only did the job for which you were qualified and the emphasis upon political reliability was reduced.
Dr. Backshire, though, seemed to be suggesting that there had now been a slowing down, a consolidation of educational development. Nevertheless, positive discrimination in favour of certain groups still continues. The emphasis seems to have altered. Rather than changing the structure of society, the system now seems more concerned to prevent a perpetuation of the intelligentsia. Professor Wesolowski of Poland has something to say on this.
Until now, there was always a shortage of free places at the universities. So if a boy or girl from working class family applied to get into the university at exams based on strictly meritocratic principle, he was from the very beginning in disadvantaged position vis-a-vis the boy or a girl from intelligentsia family. So you need a kind of equilibrating system. On the whole, these scores they are getting at entry exams, scores or additional marks for social background are not, they compose not very large proportion of the possible score. Let's say for exams based on meritocratic principles, the highest possible score is 25 points. Being a child of worker, student is getting 5 points. So it is this relation, 5 to 25. So 25 are based on meritocratic principle, only 5 on this social principle. So it is very small proportion. It increases the chances of getting through, but not very much. But it helps. It helps to some extent.
Well, how far do you think this process of weighting through points is in fact achieving this ideal of greater vertical mobility in Eastern European countries?
Well, I think this is a subject which is of considerable source of controversy. Clearly it has helped in giving access to students of peasant and worker origins, but one should point out that many of the disadvantages already exist at a level far below that of the university level in terms of the adequacy of teaching in rural areas, for example, the sorts of environment that they exist. And here, interestingly enough, one would actually see peasants as being far more discriminated against than workers, because children from working class backgrounds at least exist in an urban environment where there are far more of these stimuli that Professor Veselowski was talking about, and therefore develops his faculties in a style which makes it easier for him to gain access to higher education, whereas peasants exist in a far more isolated community, and this is reflected, for example, in the sorts of things they write about in terms of their essays, which is far more historical rather than contemporary. So in a way, one would see that this system doesn't really even out the balances between those of worker and peasant origins. If we look at studies that have been done into the possibilities that peasant children have of getting into higher education, one of the paradoxes is that those who actually do pass their exams and get in would have passed without the help of points, and those that fail wouldn't have got through even with the points had helped. And clearly, 5 out of 25, where scores are running at 19, 17, 18, does help to even out the imbalance. I think the problem really exists lower down in the scale, where you have an underrepresentation of children of peasant and working class origins going to what we would call the gymnasia, the schools which are directly in the, as it were, directly connected to going into higher education, and they tend to be, as it were, they tend to move into vocational schools and technical schools as much a result of the aspirations of their parents as well as their own aspirations, as in fact the sorts of methods of selection that are carried out into these secondary schools. So I think if we actually look at the reports into higher education and the changes which are occurring in higher education, particularly in Poland, then we can find that there has been a concern about this distinction between the vocational sector, which is something like our technical schools, and the gymnasium, or the, as it were, grammar school sector, and that they've sought to try and actually even out these the apparent disparities which are emerging.
It does appear that Hungary also has a similar weighted point system, and again here we tend to find it hasn't achieved its objective either. Dr. Berend, who's Vice-Chancellor of the University of Economics in Budapest, comments on this.
One can speak about an underrepresentation. At our university, for example, in the last year, so this school year, academic year, roughly 44% of the students came from workers and peasant families, which is much lower, of course, than the general percent of these families in the Hungarian society, a bit less, because it's more or less almost 70% in the society, and it is only 44%. So there is discrepancy, which is quite natural, of course, because children with intellectual background, coming from an intellectual family, of course, can get more inside the family. So they have a richer library at home. They talk about professional problems. So it's of course very natural And that is what the society tried to compensate and help these children from the school years already, and these preparatory courses and other forms, and also with some administrative help as well. And therefore, one can speak an openness and mobility in the Hungarian society. So these stratas cannot reproduce themselves. So a child of an intellectual family is not sure that will be intellectual, and vice versa. So there is a movement inside the society, which is not automatic, of course, because there is a very strong automatic effort in intellectual and employee families to keep this status, which is more or less natural for them.
Well, there seems to be a claim here that the society in Hungary is pretty open and pretty mobile. On the other hand, we've already seen that working class children's performance is generally less than their proportion in the population. And I think also he's admitting in this comment that there is some perpetuation of intellectual families managing to get their children into certain types of school and so on. Do you think this is a fairly realistic picture?
I would argue that there is a considerable amount of perpetuation, because as yet we have very few figures which point towards any downward mobility from the ranks of the intelligentsia. Now, if we actually just look at the problem of not who becomes the intelligentsia, but whether this intelligentsia has actually changed from that which existed in the pre-war period, or is actually becoming more of a socialist intelligentsia, more of a workers' intelligentsia, then that's, I think, the real problem. That's the things we have to look at. And there are indications that whereas some of the new members of the intelligentsia are more sympathetic, as it were, towards the leading role of the working class, etc., many of those from working class and peasant backgrounds actually tend to assimilate the values of the intelligentsia, and in fact just simply, when not lock, stock and barrel, but actually do maybe reproduce an intelligentsia. So whether it's a case of children from working class or peasant backgrounds becoming members of the intelligentsia or then perpetuating themselves, I think we also have to look at the case of what sort of values, what sort of attitudes are perpetuated, because this is where actually the changes within that society will occur. In terms of who becomes a member of the intelligentsia, well, if we just look at the case of Poland, then whereas 25% of students in 1953, for example, were of peasant origins, despite the large-scale increases in education, the numbers of students in higher education, the percentage had dropped to something like 14% 20 years later. So this does, in a way, point to a certain, I would say, rigidification, as it were, of recruitment. But at the same time, again, one could say the problem is something of which the authorities are conscious. It's something which is a constant source of, one would argue, of struggle both within the party and between the party and, say, the higher educational sector, and within the educational sector itself.
Isn't it partly, though, the case of a developing country with a broadening band of middle-class or intellectual-type occupations, which does allow some percolation upwards? Now, what's going to happen when that kind of growth begins to diminish?
Well, I would, unless something drastic is done to actually increase the facilities available to both workers and particularly peasants, lower down the scale, as I said earlier, then I would imagine that we will get a considerable amount of re-recruitment, because, in fact, 5 points which are granted for educational background frequently aren't, as I said, sufficient to get peasants in. And I think more importantly also is the fact that you have to develop educational aspirations amongst youth in rural areas, and this can only be done when more realistic opportunities are made open to them.
Special recordings for that programme were made in Eastern Europe by Andrew Blowers and Chris Cuthbertson, who also produced it. Those taking part included Dr. Tomasz Baczkaj, Dr. Berendt, and Professor Wesolowski, and George Kolankiewicz of the University of Essex. This week's television programme for the Social Sciences third level course, Patterns of Inequality, examines the causes and effects of low pay and was filmed in Edinburgh and Glasgow. You can see a repeat of this programme on BBC Two at 10 to 6 on Thursday evening. Your next radio programme will be broadcast on Saturday morning at 6 o'clock on Radio 3 VHF.